Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, we're almost back, man. I feel like pretty soon there's going to be a point in the near future where I'm going to actually see your face when we do this, like in person.
April 15th, vaccines open for all here.
Yes. And I saw Gavin was saying like June 15th, they might try to move to all open everything in California. So that is hopeful news since we've been pretty, we've been very cautious here, I'd say.
You
in
have.
Some ways.
I admire your restraint.
I mean Californians, but yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I too have been very cautious in my life.
I think I've seen you once in the whole pandemic, right? The day that they declared Biden the winner.
Yeah, I didn't give a fuck about anything that day.
That day is
just popping bottles and running around town.
I think that was it, though.
Yeah, I think that was it too. That's very sad. Well, I don't know. Not sad is how great a show we have for all you people today. So, Ben, you want to start with this Jordanian coup? Because I think these headlines caught all of our eyes over the weekends. So the Jordanian government says it has foiled a coup attempt against the current monarch, King Abdullah II. This coup attempt allegedly involved the king's half-brother, former crown prince Hamza bin Hussein, and a handful of other members of the royal family and advisors to the king. Prince Hamza managed to release a video from house arrest, even though he said his internet had been cut off, where he said he had been detained simply for attending meetings where the king and the current government had been criticized for corruption, incompetence, etc. Interestingly, in the video, he then went and criticized the government for corruption, crushing dissent, nepotism, misrule. So he's leaning into this one. The Jordanian government says that the crown prince was conspiring with foreign entities to destabilize the country, specifically with an Israeli businessman who might have ties to the Mossad. I don't know what the truth is. I do agree with the crown prince who pointed out that every government always routinely accuses people they lock up of conspiring with foreign entities. So we don't know here. Jordan has been hit hard by the COVID pandemic. Deaths are spiking. Poverty levels are spiking. The State Department has expressed U.S. support for King Abdullah and the government, the current monarch, as of other countries in the region. Ben, what did you make of these reports? And how worried do you think we should be about, political instability in Jordan, a close U.S. ally that has remained remarkably stable throughout the Arab Spring in like a pretty brutal decade or so?
Well, I think, first of all, we should be a little careful in calling it a coup attempt in the sense that that's what the Jordanian government says, but there wasn't a lot of evidence that there was a coup.
No,
you had some very senior people arrested, like former ministers and obviously the former crown prince Hamza put under house arrest of sorts. But there was no indication that the military was involved, no indication that there was like a plot. If there was, they didn't produce any evidence. What it seems like is that Prince Hamza has been critical of the government, has engaged with parts of the government's power base, tribes along the East Bank that have formed kind of part of the monarchy's base of support in Jordan. And look, here's the awkward truth for people in the U.S. and the West who like King Abdullah because he's very comfortable in bilateral meetings with Western leaders and in the salons of Europe and the United States. Mm-hmm. Jordan has a lot of problems with corruption, with long-term unemployment, with mismanagement. They cycle through prime ministers every year or two. And so while there's been this kind of appearance of stability, and certainly stability in their foreign relations and their upholding of the peace treaty with Israel, and their cooperation with the United States on counterterrorism issues, in hosting an enormous amount of refugees, particularly from Syria, there's frustrations. And what this felt like to me is, King Abdullah and his government kind of cracking down on a potentially popular rival who, frankly, is probably a bit closer to Jordanian public opinion than the king himself. And so to me, it's a warning sign, not necessarily of a imminent coup, but perhaps of a sense by King Abdullah and those around him that his rule, his over 2-decade rule, faces more dissatisfaction than we might be seeing from the outside.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we should also point out that Hamza was stripped of his status and his privileges as crown prince in 2004 by King Abdullah, who then tapped his own son for the job. Queen Noor, I believe, was tweeting that this was slander and called on her son Hamza to be cleared of all these charges. So it seems like we are just at the beginning of this thing.
Yeah, and again, like you point out, this bears watching because we haven't seen this level of infighting and rivalry in the Jordanian monarchy in a long time, and it's a reminder that all of these arrangements, these kind of autocratic arrangements in the Middle East, are a bit tenuous. Whether it's a guy like Sisi in Egypt, or whether it's the royal families in the Gulf countries, or even King Abdullah. You reminded me of an interesting story, Tommy, which was in the U.S. statement, reminded me of this. After Obama had called for Mubarak to step down, and after Mubarak himself stepped down, Obama, I was kind of saying like, what a great thing, and I'm glad that you took this step. And he said he was potentially helped by the fact that he didn't have a longstanding relationship with Mubarak in the same way that Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and the Bushes had this long relationship with Mubarak. And he said to me, I wonder if it was King Abdullah, who I like and who's kind of my generation and we get along, there's such affinity for him as just a person, and he was an interesting guy. He'd come to the U.S. and he'd ride his motorcycle up, the California coast and all this stuff. And yet, like, if you look under the rock of, governance in Jordan, they're highly dependent on foreign assistance. They don't have the resources, the oil and gas that the Gulf countries have. And yeah, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of reason for Jordanians to want more from their government. So I hope that King Abdullah's response, the American government's response as a huge provider of that foreign assistance, is not to kind of crack down on dissent, but rather try to figure out a way to be more responsive to what is bothering people in Jordan in the first place. Just locking up your half brother is not the answer here.
No, that's a very Saudi move, if we're being honest.
Totally.
I remember being in a lot of those Situation Room meetings with you during the sort of Egypt crisis before Mubarak's stepped down, and there were lots of 60 and 70-year-old generals being like, "Look, Hosni and the boys were with us," and
they were with us in the Gulf War and all this stuff. A
lot of familiarity bias there. Well, we'll keep an eye on this one. Obviously, COVID is the backdrop for a lot of these, sort of escalating situations of discontent in places like Jordan. That being said, I did want to round up some COVID good news because it has been such a dark, dark year. So, light at the end of the tunnel is the point. So, the first piece of COVID good news I saw is that President Biden just announced that a woman named Gail Smith will be his coordinator for the global COVID-19 response. Ben and I both worked very closely with Gail on the NSC in the Obama years. Obama later tapped her to run USAID. Gail is a global development expert. She helped spearhead the Ebola response in 2014 and is just like a dogged worker who gets shit done, and it made me very excited. Two, there's reports about a new COVID-19 vaccine entering clinical trials that is expected to be even more effective than the current options, and it's designed in a way that can be mass-produced in chicken eggs, like flu vaccines, which would potentially allow less technologically advanced factories around the world to create billions of doses per year. So that's exactly the kind of like surge of vaccines we need. It's going to take a while for these trials to conclude, but scientists were optimistic. Lastly, Ben, like the Biden's team rollout of vaccinations is really cooking. We saw a couple days in a row of over 4 million shots delivered per day. So, all this is to say the pandemic is far from over. Global vaccination rates are nowhere close to where they need to be. There's massive inequality, but I was glad to see Gail get this job. I was glad to see, scientific pathways to increase availability. So a lot of good news out there.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to highlight it. I'll just talk about Gail for a second. I mean, first of all, we've talked recently about, diversity of experience and kind of personality types in government, and Gail Smith definitely fits the bill. I love Gail Smith.
Totally.
And she was in the Obama White House for the first term and part of the second term, and then ran USAID. And as you said, notably spearheaded like a lot of the Ebola response, but also just a fascinating life story. Gail was a journalist. She was in Ethiopia, kind of embedded in some of the conflicts there, covering them. Then became a development expert, then founded the Enough Project that was rooted in the Darfur movement. So she's been an activist, a journalist, and a practitioner of foreign assistance. She's run the One campaign for the last few years, so deeply familiar with Africa. And what I take away from this is like they're serious about globalizing the fight against COVID, as we've talked about and urged on this podcast. And when I think about Samantha Power and Gail Smith kind of tag teaming this, it makes me excited about government in a way that I don't normally get excited, because they're both like dogged, persistent, insistent on outcomes that benefit all peoples, on equity. So I'm really excited. Once Samantha gets confirmed, Gail gets in that role. I think this is a great signal that you're going to have people that are really going to prioritize this. It's not going to be a secondary concern to vaccinate and stamp out COVID, not just in the U.S. and Europe, but in places like sub-Saharan Africa and around the world. I think this is a great signal.
We'd be in these Sudan-related meetings with Gail, and we'd be talking about some like rebel leader. She'd be like, "Oh yeah, I spent a couple of weeks out in the bush with that guy." You're like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
She was in the bush with all these people. I remember when we went to Ethiopia. She knew Ethiopia better than anybody I've met. I mean, she lived there for years, and we went to Ethiopia with Obama, and she was telling him how he had to go out. Like, he's like, "What are you doing in Ethiopia?" And she's like, I've already made arrangements. We have to go to this one jazz club in Addis. And she went on about how great this jazz club was and how they have like an after hours thing. And Obama's like, "Gail, like I'm the president of the United States. Like,
I can't do that.
I can go back to Ethiopia with you someday, hopefully, and go to this jazz club." But anyway, that's a side note. That Gail's like been out in the world. She hasn't just been living in
She's not reading
tanks
reports.
And, she hasn't just been like educating herself off of other people's think tanks reports that she then writes another report. Like, and that experience will be helpful just in the way Samantha has. Samantha was a stringer, a journalist, a writer before she was in foreign policy. I just think it's great to have people of that kind of background, and the Biden team needed that. They have a very DC oriented team. Not that Gail hasn't spent plenty of time in DC
both,
too. Yeah, but this is good.
No, it's definitely good. Some more good news out of the sort of Iran deal talks. Well, hopefully it's good news. We'll see what you think. So officials from the U.S. and Iran are, I think, as we record, Ben, hanging out in Vienna to discuss the Iran nuclear agreement. They're kind of hanging out. So the U.S. and Iran aren't directly negotiating. Instead, there are what are called indirect talks, where European diplomats are intermediaries. They are shuttling messages from, I assume, one hotel suite to another, the way you'd, I don't know, have your friend pass a note to a girl you liked in middle school. I'm kind of kidding, but it does seem, it's a touch childish. Ben, the clock is ticking here, right? Because the Iranians have an election in June. Do you think indirect talks are a sign of progress that Biden might be able to break this impasse with Iran, where each side is demanding that the other offer concessions first before they'll re-enter the deal? Like, how did you read this?
I read this as a positive step, and I've been frustrated. No secret about that. In part because I just think there was like time lost. You come in on a campaign promise of re-entering the JCPOA. Why not just re-enter the JCPOA? And I also thought that the U.S., having pulled out of the deal, could go first. But this feels like a real effort to initiate a process to get back into the JCPOA, the Iran deal. Now, as you say, there's a clock ticking here because there's an Iranian election coming up. And so there's a pretty tight window here for the U.S. and Iran to just get to brass tacks and get back into the deal. And if people, so what does that mean? The U.S. needs to do a whole bunch of things in terms of restoring sanctions relief owed to Iran under the agreement. And the Iranians need to return to all the restrictions that they were under the JCPOA. And there's this question of who goes first and how do you sequence it, which can sound complicated, but it's been done before. So when the Iran deal was reached in the summer of 2015, there was a formulation constructed called Implementation Day, which is essentially you pick a date on the calendar and you say on that date, both sides will be in full compliance with this deal. The U.S. will be in full compliance with the sanctions relief and the Iranians will be in full compliance with their nuclear steps. And there was a sequencing that led up to that. But the point is that it's been done before. They've negotiated a process where you set a date on the calendar and then a whole bunch of experts just figure out how you get from A to Z. So they can do this. I think the sticking point, just so people know, on the U.S. side is the Trump people, in part to sabotage an effort to come back into the JCPOA, stacked on a whole bunch of additional sanctions, many of which are duplicative of the nuclear sanctions. So, for instance, Iran is owed sanctions relief under the JCPOA, and the Trump team kind of double sanctioned them for some things. So the same things that they sanctioned the Iranians for their nuclear program, they sanctioned them for terrorism-related purposes too. And the Iranians will claim, I think with good reason, wait a second, you can't create a different rationale to impose the same sanctions on us that we're supposed to be lifted under the nuclear deal, right? And so the Biden team is going to have to face criticism from right-wingers in the U.S. that you're lifting additional sanctions beyond what the nuclear sanctions are. This sounds very complicated, but the simple answer, as a bunch of people have been pointing out recently, is the Trump team didn't even hide the fact that they were putting these sanctions on to foil an attempt to go back in the nuclear deal. In fact, a lot of the people that support a hawkish line on Iran said that publicly. And so the bottom line is that the Biden team needs to get back to the status quo ante of the JCPOA, which, by the way, still leaves in place a whole bunch of U.S. sanctions for other things. But you have to get to the place where the Iranians are getting their sanctions relief and the U.S. and world powers are getting all of those restrictions under the Iran deal that the Iranians have been violating in recent months and years.
Let's hope they get there, because you're certainly seeing some of the usual suspects in D.C. line up against this thing. I don't know if you saw this. There's a really creepy group for listeners called FDD, which is just this like Gulf-funded like right-wing anti-Iran group. One of the heads of it, this creep named Mark Dubowitz, tweeted on Easter. On this day, Easter and the end of Passover, we're blessed to be alive and witness the warm ties that have developed. And then at the end, he says, the end of the Islamic Republic in Iran would complete this. So he used his Easter tweet, which I did not read all of, to call for the regime change in Iran, which I think, tells you all you need to know about a lot of the critics of this deal, frankly.
I don't know about you, Tommy, but on religious holidays that are meant to signal resilience, redemption, in some cases, forgiveness, I usually like to call for the end of certain governments that bother me. Look, FDD, people should, what I've never understood is why, like a guy like Mark Dubowitz, who could not have more of an agenda, right, of regime change in Iran, not been shy or subtle about that, runs an organization called the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy that regularly flacks for authoritarian governments, right? Which has kind of always been an interesting irony why, autocratic governments in the Gulf are funding a foundation for the defense of democracies. Maybe their goal is not to defend democracies.
Seems off, yeah.
But is kind of turned to as like an impartial analyst,
all the time, all the time. Like every article, they just start to notice, like every New York Times article about Iran, like this guy is quoted in it in a way, by the way, in which they would never quote like some bomb throwing leftist. A Code Pink or something. Not a chance.
Yeah, it'd be the analogy like of having a Code Pink quote in every story about Iran, right? So take it with a grain of salt. And I don't know about you, Tommy, but I didn't pass my Easter and Passover holidays wishing the end of governments, but it's another story.
Yeah, no, my family starts every Christmas with a quiet prayer calling for the death of Kim Jong-un. So maybe Mark and I would get along. Let's talk about the Olympics, Ben, because you flagged the story. This is incredibly interesting to me. So world leaders are under increasing pressure to boycott the 2022 Winter Olympics, which are in China. The reason is an issue we've talked about a lot on the show, which is the ongoing detention of more than 1 million Uyghurs in re-education or forced labor camps in northwest China, which has been called a genocide by the U.S. So the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee would ultimately decide whether or not the United States boycotts the Olympics. But human rights groups and some, but not all Republicans in Congress are pushing Biden to weigh in or to pressure the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to try to change the venue. The White House recently seemed to show some flexibility on this and say there's no decision made, which means maybe they're considering it. Republicans are contrasting the potential Olympics boycott with Biden's comments about Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game out of Georgia to protest its voter suppression law. So China was awarded the 2022 games well before the genocide against the Uyghurs began. But obviously the treatment of the Uyghurs isn't the only human rights issue when it comes to China. There's Hong Kong, there's Tibet, there's much more. So the U.S., a little history here, the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow to protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Human rights groups are also targeting corporate sponsors of the Olympics to put pressure on them, like Airbnb, Coca-Cola, Visa. Ben, when I think back to the 2008 Olympics, you and I have talked about this before, which were also in China. They were a huge propaganda win for the Chinese government because that opening ceremony was incredible. What do you think about these calls to boycott the 2022 games? I mean, I think when you look at the 1980 boycott by the U.S. and other Western countries over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then the fact that the Russians or Soviets remained in Afghanistan another 9 years, and then we later invaded, by the way, I don't think anyone would call that a success. But how do you judge success here? What are the things you'd be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this because this is going to be an issue that we're living with for one way or another for the next year until the Olympics.
Yeah, for sure.
And on the one hand, I saw the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, saying, well, sports isn't political, and this is different. But the problem with that is that there's no question that the Chinese use things like this for political purposes. I mean, the 2008 thing was a massive flex on the world stage, and given Xi Jinping's, very assertive nature, you can bet that there'll be military parades and shows of Chinese ascendants.
Totally.
It's going to have a political purpose to it. And so that makes all these debates valid. I think that on the one hand, a boycott by the U.S., I tend to come down on what does that accomplish? It ends up kind of hurting the athletes. I remember even as a kid, learning about these athletes in the 84 Olympics who didn't get to compete in 1980, who didn't get to compete against their best competition in 84 in some areas where the Russians and Soviets and the Eastern Bloc didn't participate. And so it's worth consideration, and it should be debated because of the Uyghurs, because of Hong Kong, because of the need to just try to, this kind of steamrolling descent of China's human rights record. I mean, it's even far worse than it was in 2008. It demands attention. I do think that for the time being, the targeting of the corporate sponsorship is very interesting to me, because one of the things that we've noticed, right, is that a lot of these big corporations, a lot of U.S. venture capital, totally looks the other way on these human rights issues. I mean, some of them are literally invested in Xinjiang province. They say nothing about what's happening in Hong Kong. There's a kind of duck and cover, Hollywood studios making movies that they censor, to appeal to Chinese audiences. The idea, in the same way, by the way, that there should be discomfort for American companies around things like the Georgia law, there should be some discomfort around your investments in China and your sponsorship of things in China. This has to become a part of the conversation if China's human rights practices are going to continue to go in this direction. So I think for the time being, that's a very healthy way to channel this in terms of just spotlighting this, making this uncomfortable for the Chinese. There's going to be a lot more attention on your human rights record this time around than in 2008 when they largely got a pass. There's going to be a lot more pressure on sponsors. I do think it's pretty extreme, and you might just end up punishing athletes to pull the plug on the Olympics altogether. That's my current take. But we should all watch how this evolves, and I'm very curious what you and other people think about this.
It's really hard, man. I mean, the IOC banned South Africa from Olympic competition from 64 to 88 because of apartheid. If the IOC could do that to China until they stop a cultural genocide, that would make a lot of sense to me. I kind of agree with you, though, that these athletes who have been training their entire lives for this moment, they had no role in selecting where the games would be played. They've just done the work. It also, if we boycott, it doesn't mean that the Olympic Games won't happen. We'd obviously try to get our allies to boycott as well. But, look, they would probably be televised to the majority of the world, right? I mean, I don't know. So these things tend to be factionalized, right? The 1980 boycott was 65 Western countries boycotted, 80 participated. So it sort of split the world. All that said, I don't know if you read it yet, but the New Yorker just had a huge piece out this week on Xinjiang. That. Oh, my God. So
people should read it,
read it. They follow this woman who was held in camps for, I think a year and 8 months. And look, frankly, her story isn't the worst thing that we've read about, right? There are horrific stories of systemic rape, forced sterilizations, like some of the worst things you could ever imagine. But the like Kafka-esque nightmare that she was put through, where you don't know why you're detained, you can't get off these lists, the suspicion that you're under once you're detained puts everyone you know at risk, you're isolated. I mean, it's like, it is truly harrowing, truly evil. 16,000 mosques have been destroyed. These Uyghur families, like, first of all, Xinjiang province is the size of Alaska, right? The border spans 8 countries. So it's a massive place with tons of people. And the pervasive surveillance of these people is unlike anything, the world has ever seen before. So it's horrific. It's horrific.
Well, and the other concern, right, is that Xinjiang could be a kind of a laboratory for that kind of surveillance state. Maybe not to the extremity of camps, but the similar tactics of like total surveillance of a population to Hong Kong, to other parts of China, to exporting those technologies to other places. I think the other thing it's worth just coming back to and thinking about over time is international sports generally. Mm-hmm. My interaction with it in government was like, there's a lot of corruption there, right? I remember, this may sound like sour grapes, but when Chicago had an Olympic bid in 2009 and was bounced in like the first round, it was not even subtle. It was like openly discussed, not just by U.S. Officials, but by everybody, that like the Olympic bids were fundamentally corrupted,
There's bags of cash.
And by the way, so like fast forward to the Sochi Olympics, Russia hosted a Winter Olympic Games in a summer resort town, right? Not the kind of place that you would pick like on the normal merits, right? Which suggested that Putin had greased the wheels a little bit in the same way that he got the World Cup. And by the way, then the Sochi Olympics, famously, there were billions of dollars of contracts to build stadiums and roads that just went to Putin's cronies. That whole games was under a cloud of corruption. Then there was a huge doping scandal with Russian athletes cheating. That whole thing was gross, right? From the mess. The selection of, it's not an anti-Russian comment because I love Russians and I love Russia's role in sports, but like this was not that. This was like Vladimir Putin's personal Olympics, right?
And then they invaded Ukraine.
And then they invaded Ukraine like the week after, right? But if you look at the World Cup in Russia and Qatar and the Beijing getting the Olympics twice in like less than 20 years, like this is not like on the level here. And like, let's just kind of get, if the IOC wants to say like, let's get sports out of politics, well, like maybe like, pick some places that are a little less fraught, like I have such good memories of like the Seoul Games or the Sydney Games or the World Cup in Africa. How awesome was that in South Africa? Mm-hmm. Like it doesn't have to be in America. And I guess LA has, an Olympics in 2028.
Yep.
But I do think international sports, particularly the Olympics and the World Cup and, needs to, if they want to be apolitical, then be apolitical. Don't try to have it both ways where you're like taking the envelope of cash under the table and then saying you're above politics.
Yeah, I also think the Chinese beat out like a couple other authoritarian countries for the 2022 games.
Yeah, to be fair to the IOC, I think Kazakhstan was like the runner-up bid. So,
tough.
It's not like, it's a tough, that's fair.
Tough menu, right? Tough menu. If you were to say to me, I think this will work. I think if we boycott the Olympics and lead an effort of the world to boycott the Olympics, then the genocide against the Uyghurs would stop. It would be a no-brainer. If you told me there was a 51% chance that it would stop this atrocity from occurring, no-brainer. I don't know. I don't think that this is judging the current Chinese response to all criticism, the way they lash back, it doesn't seem like this would do it. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think you're right. I do think, though, what needs to begin to happen is corporations, venture capital, people need to start feeling like there's going to be some pushback if you just have an open spigot of money flowing into China. I mean, look, you can heap all the criticism you want on the Chinese government for developing these kind of surveillance technologies. But you know what funded a bunch of that, if not more than half of it? Like U.S. venture capital, investing in Chinese AI and things like that. I mean, so I think it can go to a Tom Cotton extreme that is uncomfortable, but I think the idea that there should at least be scrutiny on what companies are doing and where money's flowing that's a healthy thing. Even if
Totally.
even if that's not going to change everything, it just makes it harder for China to do this. They did this with impunity and to some extent for a while, and now there's more attention on. That's good.
Yeah, no, this is a good conversation to have. Obviously, like, we are no fans of what China's doing here. The juxtaposition with like the whataboutism about anti-voter suppression laws in the U.S. That conversation I have no time for. That said, you raised the 2022 FIFA soccer World Cup in Qatar. I mean, that's a human rights disaster on its own, right? Like 6,500 migrant workers have died in the process of setting that up. So, there is a bigger look. Politics and sports, they intersect. We both listen to Take Line now, so we know that to be the case. Okay, let's talk about one of our favorite people on the planet, Bibi Netanyahu. So in the last couple of episodes, we've talked about the recent Israeli elections and what it means for the Prime Minister Netanyahu's political future. The short answer is that it's still unresolved. But we do have an update on Netanyahu's corruption trial. This is from case 4000. There are so many that they had to number them. It involves allegations that Netanyahu used his authorities to do special favors for the controlling shareholder of Israel's biggest telecom company. And in return, Bibi got favorable coverage from the news outlet owned by that company. It's called Walla. So on Monday, the former CEO of Walla testified that his boss, the website's owner, ordered him to, quote, make negative articles about the prime minister and his wife disappear and to post articles that go after Netanyahu's rivals. In return, the company got regulatory relief. Ben, that sounds pretty bad, man. Like, are the walls closing in on Bibi here? What do you think?
Well, I think the reason it's so important to highlight this is, we've talked vaguely about corruption charges, and, that can sound like it's, anything, right? And some of it is like kind of gross stuff that doesn't feel fundamental to democracy, like gifts of cigars, literally, or even skimming off the top of some contract. Not that that's okay, but the reason that this is so important to highlight is, the corruption charges against Netanyahu fundamentally go to his authoritarian nature. Like, this isn't just corruption. This isn't just like skimming off the top or getting a take. This is like using your power in a fundamentally undemocratic way to control Israeli politics and media, right? And Netanyahu's been doing this for years. And oh, by the way, like the pro-Netanyahu media, it was not subtle. I mean, it was like turbocharged. And Sheldon Adelson, was a huge, investor in that. But that's one thing. Just to kind of, in the same way that there's pro-Republican Party media that Rupert Murdoch pursues in the U.S. that's gross but not necessarily corrupt. But this is literally using the powers of the state, like your regulatory authority. And I think that it was indicated by the witness, like at a value of like hundreds of millions of dollars, right? To in terms of these licenses and potential penalties versus rewards, to tilt the balance in your favor. So I think it's worth just looking squarely at this and realizing this is about corruption. It's also about anti-democratic, fundamentally illiberal governance by Netanyahu, where he's been in power so long that he's basically co-opted elements of the state to serve his political project. And that's not a democracy. That's something else. And that's what Israelis need to deal with.
Yeah, they got to get rid of him so he can just deal with these charges. I mean, it's time to move past this guy. And clearly, so it's so clear why he and Trump got along so well too, right? I mean, Trump was trying to emulate everything Bibi's been doing for decades. Let's go sort of in the same neighborhood and talk about the UAE, because according to a report in the Daily Mail, 40 women were arrested in the United Arab Emirates this past weekend for allegedly participating in a nude photo shoot on a balcony in Dubai. The shoot is believed to have been organized by a Russian man for an adult website. These women are in their like late teens, early 20s. They're mostly from Ukraine or other ex-Soviet states. But what's really scary here for these women, who clearly just thought they were like signing up for a modeling shoot or a photo shoot in this modern, like frequently Instagrammed city, these women could face serious fines or up to 6 months in jail. So, like, again, visually, Dubai is this like extremely modern city, but the UAE has strict and draconian public decency laws that they're being charged with. So, Ben, I just thought this was an awful story because it seems extremely likely that these women maybe were brought to Dubai and didn't know what the shoot was going to be until it happened, or they just had no, idea how risky the shoot would be, right? I mean, it's like a pretty public place, a balcony of a building. People are going to see it. In New York, you could imagine that kind of thing happening. But in Dubai, it can get you in serious trouble. And I really worry for them. Like, who is going to stand up for them, fight for them? I don't know if they'll have sort of diplomatic access. I mean, it seems like a huge problem.
Yeah. And I talk about the ultimate, like, punish the victims here,
Yes.
Because these are like young women from Ukraine, largely, I think. And, like, who knows under what auspices they were brought to Dubai, right? Promised money, promised cash. Who knows if they controlled their travel and freedom of movement and passports and the rest of it. Who knows if they knew that they were, going to be used in pornographic images or what have you. I think the couple things that I'd flag are like, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, in other places, by the way, Seychelles, there's this kind of luxury world out there that you and I are not a part of, Tommy, but yachts and 20 naked women on a balcony, like they kind of cultivate a bit of that.
It's an ostentatious wealth.
There's an ostentatious wealth of like Formula One races and
Yes.
yachts. So on the one hand, you're kind of cultivating this image of this place where rich people come to party or whatever. And then you end up punishing the women who were like, I don't know, potentially trafficked there, And then that leads to the second point, which is that, like, it's interesting how QAnon is so insane, right? And alleging that the whole world is run by a cabal of child sex traffickers and the like. I've been a bit worried that in the necessary pushback against that conspiracy theory, we not lose sight of the fact that there is a major human trafficking problem in the world, right? And often intersecting with the sex industry and often involving wealthy people, right? And so this is, and I know you've been like the QAnon correspondent. It's just going to be very important that as we rightly point out the absurdity of the conspiracy theories about these things, we don't lose sight of the fact that, there's gross stuff happening in lots of places. And this story is one of the stories you read. And by the way, you feel, I read like the Daily Mail story and I felt even bad just like seeing pictures of these women, like, how many people in the world are looking at pictures of these women. You read and you're thinking like, I'm seeing the tip of some iceberg here of like a trafficking operation or a sex porn industry operation. So I'm curious how, and you'll have, like, how do you separate out the vigilance against trafficking, particularly young women, as against the absurdity of the conspiracy theory? That's going to be hard work,
That was my exact take. Cause you could see like the New York Post and all these places did like articles that were like designed to just gawk at the photos, right? And you can just feel there this like subterranean element that goes deep into these inequality questions and wealth and class and misogyny. And then you're right, like the QAnon people, when they got banned from all these social media platforms, they started co-opting other hashtags like Save the Children and started hosting Save the Children events because they figured you can't ban that, right? But like, you're right, it's absolutely distracting away from like the core problem. Have you watched the HBO documentary about Q that's out now?
No, I've been a bit like I have to. Like, it's one of the things I want to watch, but like I don't want to watch.
I felt the same way. I mean, look, there's 6 episodes, so it's pretty long. There were times on like the second and third episode where I felt like I had been brought down into a rabbit hole and was learning a ton about people that my life would be better not really knowing about. But then at the end, I thought it delivered not 100% an answer for who Q is, but a pretty damn good theory of the case. And it tied it all together with the insurrection and the broader like sickness of our media ecosystem and that in the MAGA world that I thought was actually a very important story.
Yeah. No, every time I've like dove into the QAnon stuff, I've been reticent and then always found it very worthwhile. Like there was a great Atlantic cover story. And I think it's important to reckon with this as Americans that like QAnon comes up and you're like, this is batshit fucking crazy. Like our country's lost its mind. And then you're reminded that throughout American history, they're frequently batshit crazy conspiracy theories that gain massive followings that last for years, and not just like JFK, JFK assassination stuff, but I mean belief systems, right? That are rooted in conspiracy theory. That QAnon's just like the latest flavor of something that's been around. So I think it is important for Americans to kind of wrestle with why we are so susceptible to these kinds of things,
Totally. Yeah. We are a country that loves conspiracy theories, and it's been supercharged by like social media platforms and YouTube and everything. Okay. We're going to end with some quicker headlines about some important things that we wanted to make sure you guys knew about. So we've talked a bunch on the show about Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader and anti-corruption activist that Vladimir Putin tried to poison multiple times. So Navalny is currently serving a 2.5-year sentence in a Russian penal colony. He has been talking about his experience. He has horrible back pain. He has numbness in his legs. He has a high fever and cough. And he says that tuberculosis is spreading through the prison. So the health situation sounds really dire. Obviously, COVID is a big concern too. Navalny is now at least a week into a hunger strike to protest the conditions in the prison. So, a worrisome situation, Ben, about a case that had kind of fallen from the news. And I think we should try to just talk about it.
Yeah, and does anybody doubt that Vladimir Putin, having failed to kill Navalny with poison, might just kill him through like the steady mistreatment of like a grotesque penal colony in which illness is allowed to run rampant? He's denied care, and maybe he's like poisoned again. I mean, people should keep their eyes on this. And again, we talked about the amnesty decision to not make him a prisoner of conscience. I've seen some other commentary, like, pointing out like problematic statements in Navalny's past, but like this human being is being like tortured to death, for his beliefs, and his beliefs are that the state should not be fundamentally corrupt and should be democratic. Like the eyes of the world should stay on this case, because I can guarantee you that if they drift, Putin has no compunction about killing him, through whatever means he can.
Yeah, including neglect. I mean, friend of the pod, Julia Yaffe, a great journalist, flagged for me the other day that two of the doctors who had treated Navalny back in August when he was poisoned have died, and another has quit his job. So
this is scary shit. I mean, and this is, again, like where I get, I mean, just to grind another axe here, like the kind of, there's a left strain, right? That all the criticism of Putin is overblown, and Russiagate, and this guy's a terrible person. I don't
get that.
I don't get that. I just don't get in this zeal to like dunk on, I don't know what, like the Mueller investigation or something. We become apologists for Putin, or we diminish, what he's doing, or the whataboutism about American prisons. Look, whatever your points of view, this is wrong, and it shouldn't happen, and people should call it out.
Yeah, we should be able to hold two ideas in your head at once.
Exactly.
It's not that hard. The other thing I want to point to, or two more, the BBC published evidence of a massacre by the Ethiopian military in the country's northern Tigray province. We've talked about this a few times since late last year. I think it was around November, October. There has been intense fighting between the Ethiopian government and members of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, which is a resistance movement in this northern province. The conflict has just very quickly created a humanitarian disaster. Millions of Ethiopians have been displaced. Thousands have been killed. So what the BBC did was they obtained video of Ethiopian troops murdering prisoners and then shoving their bodies off of a cliff, literally. And so, unfortunately, this evidence is probably just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the horrors of this war. Ben, are you seeing signs that there is enough of an international response to like do anything to end the fighting, to seek some accountability? I don't know. I think I've asked you this exact question before because I'm just wondering when we'll hear more about this.
Do you sense this kind of like growing alarm from the EU and from the US? But I still think that you could see more, in the sense that like this has the potential to, as we've talked about, spill over, and refugees going into Sudan, and conflicts kind of migrating to Somalia, and instability in that whole region where Ethiopia was kind of an anchor. Sudan, South Sudan, Somalia, places where conflict can really run out of control fast. So there's the need to kind of get this under control, the need to get humanitarian access. And Samantha Power's, already been beating this drum even before she's gotten into the job of like, we got to get humanitarian access into Tigray to just start trying to save lives. And in part because humanitarian access is a check on fighting. If you get aid workers in there and the international community has a presence. But yeah, I'd like to see like just more sustained high level attention. We should talk on a future pod. The UN Security Council just feels totally absent from everything that's happening in the world, whether it's Myanmar or Tigray. I get that China and Russia hold things up, but we got to find other ways to make the UN system work, because back in the day, you would have had like a bunch of emergency meetings and passed some resolutions and put some pressure. That doesn't feel like it's happening. And if it's not going to happen there, like then you're going to have to do it on your own. So I think this has been building. I think the Biden team has tried to prioritize this, but I do think you can't overstate the humanitarian and political and geopolitical necessity of focusing on this. And that video, you just can't look away from that. Well, you don't want to watch it, nor can you look away. It's horrifying.
Yeah, it's horrifying. Yeah, I mean, the urgency is like literally intervention now to stop, thousands more people from being killed.
We don't want to, you don't even position in like 10 years where you're wondering how did it come to be that like 1 million people got killed in a multi-country conflict. And this was like the starting point, like this small thing, and not small, but this seemingly smaller conflict in Tigray. Like it feels like we got to get our arms around this faster.
Yeah. You mentioned Myanmar. So update there is that Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the duly elected leader of Myanmar, she was deposed by a military coup back in February. She and several of her ministers were charged with breaking the country's official secrets law. This could carry a prison sentence of up to 14 years. I also saw that the military has ordered internet service providers to shut down wireless broadband services. This comes on top of them shutting off the internet to people's phones every night. So it's really scary stuff. Also comes in the wake of just, ongoing escalating violence against peaceful protesters in the midst of this general strike by huge swaths of the population. Ben, you know way more about Burma than I do, but I saw this New York Times piece, and then it was an episode of The Daily over, I think, on Monday, that talked about just how separate the military is from the rest of society. Like soldiers don't marry into, like soldiers marry other soldiers' families. It seems like they barely communicate with civilians. I guess I just didn't realize that it almost had a sectarian dynamic that can feel, zero sum for the people involved.
Yeah, no, and this, I mean, like it's such a strange dynamic because the military, it's almost, it's like a separate organism ruling the people. And Aung San Suu Kyi was always the emblem of the actual people. And part of her overwhelming support, part of it was she's the daughter of the founding father of Myanmar, the man who led them to independence after World War II. Part of it is that she has incredible charisma herself. But part of it is just that she was the only emblem to put your hopes and aspirations into, like she became the only alternative really. And when she was under house arrest, she was kind of experiencing the same thing the whole country was experiencing, right? Everybody felt persecuted and traumatized by this military. And that's why, again, I just think the military, they have, there's no way in which they can co-opt public opinion. There's this kind of all or not, either they literally put the entire country essentially in prison or they're going to be finished. And that's the kind of the extent of the zero-sum dynamic. I do think it's also just worth noting that she got a lot of criticism for not speaking out, obviously, about the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya. Mm-hmm. Deserved criticism. And we've talked about that. I wrote a long piece with Atlantic about this. I will say that she would always say, "There's, if I push too hard, there's going to be another coup," and a lot of people dismiss that as alarmist. This in no way, shape, or form justifies her silence on Rohingya.
No, of course.
It's just to say that she wasn't wrong about her criticisms of the military, I guess is the point. And people should remember that. I think the military is playing a dangerous game if anything happens to her. There's already been a movement. I mean, the place will just blow. And so, this bears watching too, because she's old and not in the strongest health to begin with. So I just think Myanmar is not going to go away. This is not an issue because the people are not going to accept the military. So whether it becomes a failed state, whether it turns into some kind of civil war, whether there's kind of flare-ups of horrific massacres, like, unfortunately, tragically, until this is sorted out, I think this is going to be on our radar screen.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Finally, to conclude, Michael our fantastic producer, Michael Martinez, had recommended we talk about a story about how there's an epidemic of dognapping in the United Kingdom. Apparently, dogs are hard to come by. You can't buy them. You can't adopt them because of the pandemic. Everyone dogged up, as we should. And now criminals are stealing people's dogs and trying to sell them or extorting money from them. And I'll be honest, Ben, I couldn't really get through the article because, if someone came up to me and said, give me your phone, give me your wallet, give me your keys to your car, I'd be like, take it all. If someone came up to me and tried to take my dog, I think I would fight them to the death. And it would probably be my death, if we're being honest.
Just like, come on, guys. What the fuck? Just think about what we've talked about. Like, can we not dog nap on top of that? I mean,
can we steal anything else? Maybe not children. Maybe not dogs. How about
no living things? How about that?
No living things.
No living things stolen.
That's a good rule of thumb, even for the worst people on the planet. Just steal anything else. Hey, I got a good TV recommendation for you because we haven't done this in a while.
Yeah.
There's a show on Netflix called Last Chance U. They usually follow a junior college football team. The first 2 seasons were about football teams in various places. They were good seasons. The problem is the coaches were just some of the shittiest people like you've ever been around. The latest season is about basketball, and it's at a community college in Eastern LA. And it's this group of players and this coach who is just like 3 coaches who seem like some of the better humans you'll ever meet. And it follows this team through this season where they're trying to compete for this sort of national junior college championship. And all these kids are like players that could have gone D1 or didn't have the grades or got in some trouble or, you know what I mean? Or like needed that extra year. And it's just the most heartbreaking, but also inspiring season of TV I've seen in a long time. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I don't know if I've done this on the pod, but The Bureau, like I'm just totally obsessed with The Bureau. I know that's like a trendy thing now, but like if you want, it's a French show, but trust me, like you'll get past the subtitles quickly. This is like the best espionage show I've seen in years. And then, I mean, one plug, because I just got an email today from friend of the pod, Patrick Raddenkeefe. His book coming out about the Sackler family. I have not read it yet, but I can't wait to read that because I'm sure in the same way that everything that guy writes is about what he's writing about, but it's also about everything else. Like the story of how this family got us all addicted to opioids and profited off of it and then used philanthropy and political donations to insulate itself, like is clearly a story about what's happened in America the last 20 years. So keep your eyes peeled for the release of that book. I think it's next week.
So I have zero sympathy for the Sackler family. I hope they lose all their money and go to prison where appropriate. That said, could you imagine getting a call from Patrick Raddenkeefe saying, hey, I'm working on a big article about you or your family business? That's got to be the scariest fucking phone call that you're ever going to get because that guy is going to get to the bottom of what you're doing. You have no hope of hiding it.
Yeah, it's like one of those 80s TV shows that has like an Avenger, like, The Equalizer or something. Like when the phone rings, like the gig is up, guys. You're fucked. Yeah, it's like him or Jane Mayer, like they're gonna smoke you out.
Yeah, no, you have no chance.
But I'll tell you, Tommy, as a New Yorker, like what's gross is you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, right, which is like the big museum there. The fountains outside are named after the Koch brothers. Mm-hmm. All the wings inside are like the Sackler wings. It's just kind of like awful that they basically try to buy off like social standing for their grossness, which I guess is an American tradition. I guess the robber barons used to do that. But hopefully we can like put some better names on those things.
The other TV recommendation that came to me was from our friend Nick Shapiro, who actually worked at the CIA, and Ben LeBolt. They recommended this German spy show that's set in like the 80s. It's like sort of a East German, West German military or spy unit. that's on Amazon. The name is escaping me. It's in German. It's subtitled, but it's also a pretty good like espionage story if you're looking for that.
Oh yeah, no, I'll check that out. I mean, I have to say, I also tore through Ted Lasso in about 2 days. So,
oh yeah, that's just a
don't miss it if you have
experience.
Yeah, if you have any like reservations, put those reservations aside. You know, just gorge. It's like a nice little happy sugar high amidst the darkness.
Treat yourself.
Yeah, treat yourself.
There you go. That's it for us this week. Watch Ted Lasso, and that's your homework. And we'll talk to you next week.